Well, we're still a minute or two away from 10 o'clock in the morning, which is when I said I would start. Not really sure. There's a few people already watching. It's kind of hard for me to see with my glasses on, so I have to take them off to look. So we'll get started in a minute. I hope everyone's having a good morning so far, or a good afternoon, depending on where you are, a good evening, even in some cases. Uh, if you're not already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. The more people that subscribe, the easier it is for me to produce content and get it seen. I just said produce content. I hate myself now. Uh, but this is the first of what I hope will be weekly or maybe bi-weekly live streams in my shop where I show some technique, maybe talk about something that I'm making right now, and also talk about design, which is something that I really enjoy doing. So anyways, it is now 10 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and get started for real. This morning I'm going to cut some dovetails by hand through dovetails and talk about what I've learned through the years that allows me to cut dovetails that look nice and also are tight fitting, so there's no gaps in them. It's you'll find that it's actually not really about the technique of actually cutting. It's more about your layout and understanding what your layout means and how to uh, take advantage of your layout so that your dovetails come out fitting the way that you want them to. I will try to answer questions as they pop up. I'm not sure that I'll be able to because it's if I'm working, I'm not looking at my phone to see what is being posted. Um, excuse me. I have seasonal allergies. That's not the COVID-19. Anyways, so when I start to think about dovetails or any joinery, you have to start thinking about that when you're milling materials for the project. So if you're making a wall cabinet that has through dovetails at the corners, you need to think about the location of your joinery and when you are milling. Because if you try to locate the joint, if you end up locating the joint right where the grain switches from one direction to the other in a board, you'll have more trouble cutting that joint and getting good, clean joinery out of it. So when you're laying out the parts in your rough lumber, you need to think about things like grain direction because it will allow you to cut better joinery if you have grain all running in one direction. And it's also an aesthetic thing. You want to locate your parts on the rough lumber so that the grain looks the way that you want it to look on the completed piece. Now, some other things that you should be thinking about as you're milling that affect dovetails in particular, excuse me, are really all joinery. When you're milling, and this goes from the joiner through the planer to the table saw where you're ripping the width and cutting to length, you need to end up with square parts. Now, especially, well, really a drawer, a case piece, anything like that is a box of some, it's a box. And in order for a box to end up square, you need to have the opposing sides be the same length. So in the case of a case with dovetails at the corners, your pin boards need to be the same length and your tail boards need to be the same length. You need to make sure that that happens when you're cutting them to final length. And of course you want them to be the same width as well. If the width is a little bit off from the pin board to the tail board, it's going to mess up the location of when you transfer things. And finally, the last thing you want to think about when you're milling up stuff is snipe. Most planers rather, do create a little bit of snipe on the ends of boards as you're running them through. You want to get rid of that in some fashion when you're milling. You either can leave the board long and then cut the snipe off, or have it closer to the final length, and then hand plane the surfaces to get rid of the snipe. If you lay out or set up your marking gauge, for example, at the end of a board that has snipe on it, it's going to be slightly shallower, so to speak, or the gauge setting is going to be slightly shorter than it really should be. And you're going to be left with doing more surface prep after the case piece is together, because you're going to have to bring all the rest of that material down to the same level as the snipe. So you want to make sure things are square. You want to make sure that there's no snipe. And you want to make sure that your parts are the same dimensions. That's all critical. And then the last thing to think about in terms of milling before you start cutting your joinery is actually surface prep. You have to think about, if I do surface prep after I've cut my joinery and put it together, how is that going to affect the joinery? Can I do something like surface prep on the inside of a cabinet after it's together? Well, you can't do it after the case is glued together, so you're going to have to do it before you glue the case together. Now, if you do it before you glue the case together, but after you cut the joinery, that will affect the fit of the joinery a little bit. So what I always do is my surface prep on the inside of a case piece before I cut the joinery. And so those are all things to keep in mind before you get started. And that's because joinery is not an isolated event. Joinery takes place in the flow of construction. When you're in the shop making a piece of furniture, you're sort of like a conductor in charge of a symphony, and the piece of furniture is that overall harmonic piece of music that's being created, and then the pieces of the individual instruments are all the individual things that you do along the way to creating it. And it's your job to take all of those individual tasks and to synthesize them or bring them together in a harmonious way to produce something that is pleasing and utilitarian and well made. So joinery never takes place in isolation, and that's why you have to think about it when you're milling, when you're doing surface prep, and when you're building the case as a whole, and when you're designing all of that. So it takes part of a larger operation, and you have to keep that in mind. All right, now I'm ready to get started on actually cutting the dovetails. I'm going to move the camera some. Hopefully that won't be too distracting. And like I said, or as I announced on my Instagram feed, I'm going to be doing this all with hand tools today. I don't normally cut dovetails all with hand tools, but the primary point I hope that you get out of this is that the tools that you use don't really matter. What's important to cutting good dovetails are the things that translate or that are true of cutting dovetails no matter what techniques or tools that you use. So I'm going to emphasize those things today. Maybe another time I'll show you how I actually cut dovetails most of the time, which involves the bandsaw for the tails and then a router for the pins. But I wanted to start off with hand tools because it's quiet and it's easier to do live than to do with than machinery would be. So it's all hand tools today. I've got 3 chisels out, and maybe I'll show you all that now, what I've got out. No one wants to see me that closely. So here are the tools that I have out. You can see I've got 3 chisels out. One is for cleaning up the shoulders at either edge. These are for cleaning up in between the tails. And when I get to cleaning up between the pins, I'll probably have to get another chisel out that's a little bit wider. I've got a saw. I'm going to use a back saw today. My carcass, I'm going to use a dovetail saw. My carcass saw, which I would prefer to use, is actually a little too dull right now. I need to send it out to get sharpened, so I'm not going to be using that. I've got a marking gauge, and I've got a ruler or a rule, a bevel gauge, a couple of pencils that I've already sharpened, and a small square. And as far as lumber goes, Well, now I've only got one pencil that's sharp. I've got a piece of cherry and a piece of basswood. I chose two different species in part because I wanted you to be able to see more easily the work that I was doing, and the contrast between the two species helps, but also because basswood is a good example of a wood that can be hard to work, especially with hand tools like white pine. You often hear people complain about white pine and how it breaks under their tools when they're paring and things like that instead of cutting cleanly. And the solution for that, working in any wood like basswood or white pine or Douglas fir, if you're having trouble with crushed fibers, the problem is not the wood. The problem is your tools. Your tools are not sharp. If you have sharp tools, they will sever cleanly and they won't crush. So if you get to that point where you're doing some work in cutting dovetails in a soft wood and you're having bad results, you need to sharpen your tools. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, when it comes to layout, you can either cut tails first or pins first. In other words, you can do it the right way or you can do it the wrong way. I know there are probably a few instances where cutting pins first makes sense, but generally speaking, cutting tails first is what you want to do. And the reason for that is that it's just easier to fit pins into the sockets between the tails than to try to fit tails to the sockets between the pins. Generally speaking, that's what you want to do. It's easier to cut tails first than pins first. Now, I'm going to lower this down a little bit. So one of the questions is, when it comes to layout, how thin can the pins be between the tails? Now, the closer the pins and the tails are to being equal in size, the stronger the joint's going to be. But it doesn't really affect the functional, like the useful strength of it to make the tails wider than the pins, and that's normally what you see. You don't need to go super thin, but you can definitely make the tails significantly wider than the pins. It'll be plenty strong enough, and it'll look a lot nicer too. So I'm going to start with laying out the tails, all right? And the first thing you want to do is take your marking gauge, and you're going to set that to the thickness of your parts. Now in this case, they're both the same thickness. And I'm going to set that. It's a little... I do prefer a gauge with a knife in it over one with a wheel or a pin. Now I did last night sharpen the blade in this, and you do want it to be sharp because then you're going to get a cleaner cut. That first pass can be kind of light, and some people will only take one pass. I have found it's not a problem to take more than one. In fact, later when you're pairing, it turns out to be beneficial to have a deeper shoulder. So I take multiple passes to get a nice deep shoulder. Because this is a tailboard, you need to go around all four faces, the two faces and the two edges. On the edges, you want to be careful to keep the head of the marking gauge flat on the end grain so that that layout line doesn't dip down at all. Because if it dips down and then later you pair to it, you're going to have a shoulder that doesn't, there's going to be a gap between the shoulder and the pin board. All right, so now I have cut my lines. I don't know how easy that is to see. So I've scribed all the way around on this one, and I'm going to go ahead and scribe on my pin board. Now the pin board only gets lines on the two faces. There is no line on the edges. So I'll set that aside. Now we want to talk about layout for the actual dovetails. The way I do that is I want to try to get them as symmetrical as possible across the length of the board or the width of the board. And on this one, normally you have what's called a half pin on the edges. So that would be if in the middle of the board your pin's going to be a 1/4 inch wide, then out here it would be 1/8 of an inch. It doesn't have to. You don't have to stick to those conventions though. I'm going to go with 3/16, and I'm not going to translate that into metric. Now I know that's probably hard to see what I'm doing, but that's just the restrictions of doing this live. I'm going to take my bevel gauge, lay out that line, come over to the other edge, and lay out that line. This is roughly 5 inches wide, which would be about a normal wall cabinet. And I would normally have 2 wide dovetails and then a narrower one in the middle. That's what I'm going to do here. This leaves me like 4.5 inches. So if I go with an 1.5 inches, I'm going to go with 1 5/8 inches. Then just go 3/16 again in between. Now, the angle that you use depends on a couple of different things. It can depend on the species of wood that you're using. Softwoods are typically at a less pronounced angle. Hardwoods can be a little more pronounced, but it also can deal with the thickness of the parts. So if you have particularly thick case pieces and you put a really steep angle here, then down at the shoulder it's going to be kind of narrow, and that could be a strength issue. It could also just be aesthetically unpleasing. So for thicker stuff, you want this angle to be not as angly. You want that slope to be a little straighter, up and down. So I've laid out my 3 dovetails, and this is going to go in my vise now. And I'm going to transfer those lines across the top of the board or across the end grain to help me cut straight that way. Last one. All right, so now I'm ready to cut. Using a handsaw is all about body mechanics. And let me see if I back that up just a little bit. Sorry about that. I inadvertently turned the phone off. Using a handsaw is all about body mechanics. And you want to allow your arm to move forward and back in a straight line like a piston. And that will allow you to cut, that'll help you cut a straighter line. So in order to do that, you have to turn your body almost 90 degrees. So you can't stand like this. You got to turn your body like this. And you want to bend your knees a bit. And I start with the saw tilted up a bit and just make a nice easy cut on the far side of the board. By the time I reach the side closest to me, the saw is now level. And it's a matter of, I choose to hold the saw at an angle rather than angling the board. And you stop at your layout line. You can see why, although this saw is deep enough to cut this full depth, a carcass saw, which is a little bit taller and would cut a little more aggressively, would be a better option for something this thick. Now here's something you might wonder, well, how do you keep your saw perfectly at that angle, and what happens if you cut into the pencil line? It doesn't matter. What's going to matter is how well the tailboard fits the pin board. If you get that fit to be really nice and tight, then little discrepancies in the angle are not going to be noticeable by the eye. So I've now defined the tails all the way across the board. The next thing to do is to get rid of the waste in between the two tails. There are a lot of different ways you can do that. The only way that I do it anymore is with a coping saw. I've got the blade angled at 45 degrees. So just come down into the curve. All right, there we go. And you turn it and come across your marking gauge line. Why is that not? There we go. This is much faster than chopping out the waste. Because you're only left with a little bit to pare rather than to cut. You have this material on the edges that needs to go. Do not do that with a coping saw. You can do it with your dovetail saw. Even though it's designed for ripping, it's fine. I often will pull down one of my Japanese Dozukis and do it that way. But as I'm showing you, you can do it. Now, it is the one place it's really important that you do not cut past your layout lines is on the shoulders, because you want that shoulder to come up nice and clean and tight to the pin board. So if you cut beneath your marking gauge lines, it's not going to do that. So I've left a little bit of waste there. So I do need to get rid of the waste between the last little bit of waste here in between the tails. What I do is take one of my chisels, and I'm going to now cut along that marking gauge line to create a little bit of a shoulder where I will be able to register the back of my chisel. And I'm going to do that on both sides. And I always pair sitting down. I find it easier on my body, but also easier to control the chisel, easier to cut along the baseline than laying the board flat on the bench and holding the knife like the chisel like this. So I'm slowly just paring away the material that's there until I get down to that shoulder that was created by my marking knife, and then I put the chisel flat on that and push in, and I should then have a nice clean shoulder, roughly halfway through the thickness of the board now. Coming from that one side, flip it around, coming from the other. And the reason you come in from both sides is that it prevents, you won't tear out any grain on either side then. It is okay to undercut. In other words, to have it come a little bit down in the middle. There's no glue strength there, so it doesn't really matter. All your glue strength is coming from long grain to long grain, so the sloped side of the dovetail where it touches the pin, that's where your glue strength is. So it is okay to undercut a little bit. Now it's important that at the bottom, where the angled side of the tail touches the shoulder, that you have a true crisp, pointy corner. And a lot of bench chisels do not have a point down there. Now, the chisels that I use happen to have a very short or small flat there, and they do a really good job. But I normally take one of these paring chisels that I have, and you can buy ones that are like this. The cross section is it is a triangle, and it allows you then to get right into that corner and get rid of any material in there. All right, so now I just have these two edges to do, and the way I do that is I remove the waist to create that shoulder, and this is, hopefully you guys can see what I'm doing here. My God, you can see part of my messy shop. So I have a small shoulder here, and on the face of the board, and a small shoulder here on the edge of the board that was created by the marking gauge. If I take my chisel now and put it on this shoulder here Just a little bit, like not even 1/8 of an inch. That's very easy to remove that material without going down beneath the layout line. And every little pass I take, I get a wider shoulder to follow, for my chisel to rest on and to follow. It's a little too much waste here. And make sure that comes down to a clean corner. So you're using your marking gauge lines as a reference for your chisels, so that all of these shoulders are in the same plane, and that allows you to, that's how you eliminate the gaps that you might get there. All right. This chisel is the one that I use when I make kumiko, and it has not been sharpened in about a week, and it needs to be sharpened because it is crushing the fibers rather than severing them. All right. So I hope that today I'm as good as my talk, and that when I assemble the joint, there won't be any gaps there. All right, let me just check coming in from here. Now we're going to get to the most important part of cutting dovetails. Now, the initial layout and how the dovetails look, you know, that's, you know, you want nice looking dovetails, the layout of them to be nice. But when you lay out the marking gauge, that's important because it gives you that reference for your chisel to create a clean, straight shoulder across the width of the board. And, you know, when you're cutting, that's not so important because that angle doesn't actually matter. It can be almost anything. What's important is that you create a clean shoulder for the pin board to come up against. And when we transfer now, this is critical because we want the pins to fit into the sockets between the tails without any gaps. That's what's going to make your joint strongest and also look the best. So it's not the cutting of the tails that's super important. It's the transferring the tails to the pin board. That's important. I do need one thing, a little device, not really a device, a little block of wood that I use when I transfer. So I'm going to step away for just a second to grab that, and I'll be right back. So what I have here is this side. This is a square of wood with another piece of wood glued onto it. And actually, I got this from my former colleague at Fine Woodworking, Mike Pekovich. He came up with this idea. And this allows you to set the height of the pin board in the vise very easily for transferring. You'll see a lot of people, instead of using something like this, they'll use a plane or something like that, which works fine, but this works flawlessly. So, but they are very simple to make. It's just, like I said, a piece of wood that's been milled square, and then a thin piece of wood glued to one edge. And I'll show you how that's used now. So I'm going to take, so here's my pin board, slide that down in. Now I'm going to set my block flat on the bench, and the pin board gets pushed up and touches the little overhanging piece of wood. So now I can just pinch it there. And now if I flip this back, I know this is not exactly the best angle to see this. If I flip it back now, I can set my tailboard on it, and that holds it at exactly the right height so that this is parallel, or it's level as I transfer the tails. And that actually is important because if you introduce a little bit of an angle when you're transferring it, it's going to affect in a sense, the shape of the pin board or the pins, and that will affect how well the joint goes together. Now, I'm about to do something which a lot of people might find a little odd, but what I'm going to do is use a pencil to transfer these tails to the pin board. And a pencil, most people use a marking knife. I don't like to use a marking knife. I can see a pencil line more easily. And also, if you think about what a pencil line means, for me, it makes it easier to cut accurate pins that fit into the sockets better. My pencil line is going to be completely on the pin. If I remove any pencil line at all when I'm pairing later, it means my pin will be too thin for the socket that it's supposed to fit into. So it's a visual indicator of where I'm supposed to pair the pin walls to. I keep the entire pin line because the entire pencil line is on top of the pin. All right, so what I've done is use just a square to align the front edge of the case. When I'm making it, I align the front edge. The back, if it's a little bit off, is okay. I'll take care of that after the joint's together. I also, and this is something I got from Chris Bexford, a furniture maker in Maine, instead of aligning the shoulder of the tailboard with the inside face of the pin board, I'm actually going to move it just a little bit forward, just a hair, just so it overlaps a tiny little bit. And what that'll do is when you bring the two together, it's going to pull them really tight. So it will pull the shoulder up tight onto the pin board. All right. Now I'm aligning them here. It's not only is it aligning them so that the edges are in the same plane, but it's also ensuring that it's square. So and this is an exaggeration, let me grab the phone. So if I do this really at a square, like that, maybe I should turn this around. This is an exaggeration, obviously, but if it's really at a square, when I transfer, then when I put the case piece together, it's going to be at a square as well. So it needs to be square like this, and then also aligned up here. All right. Now, I cannot transfer the tails and hold the phone at the same time, but what I will do, let me see. If I move this around, all right, you can see a little bit of my tripod poking in there. All right, maybe I'll be able to see it that way now. Let's see. This you want to use a sharp pencil for. So again, I'm going to align them that way, Also make sure it's square like that. Have it overhang just a small little bit, which I'm judging with my thumb. Now I'm going to transfer. So this entire pencil line is on material that I want to keep. All right, there we go. So I've transferred those lines. Now what I will do is raise this up a little bit. And I transfer these lines down so that I have a reference to get as straight as cut as I can here. And then, it's not a bad idea, and I normally do this, I mark what the waist is so that I make sure I cut out the right thing this next step. All right. Now this angle is really bothering me, so I'm going to move the camera back to where it was. Well, I'll leave it here. This will allow you to see the body mechanics a little bit better. But I am going to turn it around again so that I can see what you see, which is my ceiling. All right. Which is still my ceiling. All right. Yeah, that's just not very, it's just not good. All right. Well, you can just see my Oliver joiner over there. And if you're wondering, yes, I really do keep my shop as clean as it appears to be right now. It's actually, I think, a little bit messy. Yes, it is a beast. All right. So like I was saying earlier with body mechanics when sawing, you want your arm to move like a piston. If there's any curve in that piston, then there's going to be a little bit of a curve in your cut. So you want to keep it moving straight back and forth. And that means that you're turning your body so that it is in line with the saw. Oh, I almost started to cut on the wrong side of the line there. All right. Now here it is important that you don't, because of the way I laid out my dovetails with a pencil, that I do not cut away any of that pencil line. Try to cut as close to the pencil line as I can because it means less work for me when it comes time to fit. Sometimes, well, that'll be all right. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about, getting their tails to cut straight off the saw, and I say, great for them. I don't really care if I do that. What I care more about is the dovetail fitting properly and looking good when it's done. And if I have to do a little bit of paring to get there, I'm okay with that. So just like with the tailboard, I'm going to remove the waste with a coping saw. When I first learned to cut dovetails, my buddy Joe Mazurek taught me chopping out the waste. And I did that for a long time, and I hated cutting dovetails because of it. And then I saw someone remove the waste with a coping saw, and I tried it, and I was like, holy shit, how come I haven't been doing this all along? Now, oh, come on. Okay. Now here you want to cut as close to the line as you can, because a hardwood like cherry is harder to pare than basswood. The basswood was really easy, goes really fast. Cherry's going to be a little bit tougher. Sometimes I do this and I get freaked out because I think I've cut beneath the line accidentally. Alright, so that's done. Let me show you how close I did get to the line. Maybe give you an idea of what you can do. So all of this is fine right there. That's a little close, but I think it's fine. The rest of it's fine. So now I've got most of the waste cleaned out, and I'm going to go back with my chisel and pare down. So. And that's the big advantage of coping, is that it's just so much faster. And then all you're doing is paring with the chisel. Ooh, going for a wild ride. Instead of chopping. And that actually means your chisel will stay sharper longer. All right. Some other time I'll do half blind dovetails, because the process is a little bit different. All right, I might go grab another chisel that's sharper than this one. I'm actually gonna. So what I'm doing, just as I did with the tailboard, I'm going back and removing that material along the line that I cut with my marking gauge to create that reference shoulder. And I was just doing something you should never do, which was I had my finger in front of the chisel. All right. when you're paring, and generally when you're using a chisel, you get the most control by holding it down near the cutting edge. So you'll see I always have it wrapped in my hand like this. And then this is just used to push. And then all the control is coming from my left hand in this case. Yeah, this chisel is not sharp enough. I'm going to grab another one of my chisels. I actually just grabbed a whole slew of chisels. I can see that one's got a little bit of a... Now this is that's a true paring chisel, and it's not. All right. This is a chisel that I sharpen. I have two like this, the Stanley Sweethearts. I sharpen them and take them when I teach Kumiko, because invariably someone shows up with a chisel that was, their dad used to open paint cans with, 55 years ago. And that just doesn't cut it, literally. Okay. That's why it's moving. All right. I made this workbench in December of 2008. It was a video workshop for fine woodworking, and in the video we never addressed how I attached the lid, not the lid, the top to the base, and it wasn't in the plans either, so I always get asked this question, and the truth is I didn't, and it's still not attached, and generally it's never a problem. I moved my bench a little bit this morning to make it easier to do this, and that's why it was sliding, because it wasn't up against the base. Yeah, that one's crapped out on me. Man. This is some really hard cherry. All right, so that's gone. But you can tell it's hard, but those chisels are just not quite sharp enough. Normally I would stop and sharpen my chisel, but that's not really why I'm here this morning. You can see this chisel, which I did sharpen last night, is not having any trouble with the cherry. All right, Need to flip this around. Now when it comes to fitting later, a lot of times the pins kind of get fatter towards the bottom, and that's just, you know, natural when you're cutting, that can happen. And so at this point, I'm looking and I'm making sure that I get, you know, over into these corners, because they're probably, but you don't want to get too aggressive at this stage because you want too wide. That's more something you do when you're fitting them at the next stage. I don't know, this stuff is really hard. I have found that the cherry I get that is from Connecticut is typically a lot harder than the cherry I get that comes from other locations. And there is a lumberyard that I go to that all their lumber is from Connecticut. So I believe it's owned by a power company of some sort. And so whenever they have to take trees down, they send it to this lumberyard of theirs. And one thing they do is a lot of is they make the really big square timbers that can then later be laid down out in the forest so that the machinery can roll over it and not sink into the mud and the dirt. All right. So I'm going to leave that face until it is time to fit the pins to the tailboard. Ooh, I don't. I don't know how long we've been going at this. Almost an hour. I thought it would take about an hour. All right. Boy, that is just some seriously hard cherry. Now it is important that you don't have any high spots on these shoulders, because if you do, when you bring the joint together, you'll end up with gaps at the shoulder line. So you can check that with a square, and that's all. Ideally, when you do that, it touches on either side, and And that all looks to be pretty good to me. So now I'm going to try to fit. Well, I know that that's got to come away. One of the nice things about using, so you know, usually like if this were an actual case piece, like a credenza or a wall cabinet, then I'd be, you know, it'd be two pieces of cherry coming together. For a drawer, I often use basswood for the sides. And so one of the nice things about basswood is that it's very compressible. Now you see that's going against the grain, and that's why it tore out like that, instead of pairing very easily. And that means that you can get a little bit tighter of a fit at this stage and knock the joint together, and in the end that gives you a better, you know, a tighter fit for the joint. But you can't really do that if you're using two truly, you know, hardwoods in the colloquial sense of woods that are not soft. Now I'm trusting my layout lines here, which normally works out pretty well for me. Hopefully it does today. It's still going to be going against the grain. One thing I do normally with this, just take a piece of scrap and put it on, hold it tight on the back side so that I can pair all the way through and not worry about tear out. That all looks pretty good. Let's clean it up and let's see how close I am. All right. Okay. Hopefully, is it going this way? Or does it go, oh, it goes this, all right, it goes this way. All right, so I can tell, all right, it's going down, but it's a little bit tight. It's a little too tight. So, and it's mostly tight, it's mostly here, this middle pin where it's tight. So I'm going to now I know that because I can feel where I'm getting resistance as I push the tailboard down. Something else you can do is you can take your pencil and put pencil lead in here in between. And then when you seat the joint, that pencil lead will transfer. Oh my God. Oh. And tell you where things need to be pared down. Now there's too many chisels out. Well, okay. Now I said that it gets a little wider at the bottom at times. And if it is that way, what it'll do is spread the tails apart and it'll look gappy up here when in fact it probably isn't. Because like right now when I fit this, this is not gappy, but I have a feeling that it's down here. I can feel that it's it gets fatter at the bottom, and that's causing, that spreads the pins out, and so it makes the joint gappy. So I'm going to try to straighten those out. Yeah. Because wouldn't it kind of suck if I was going through all this and then my joint was gappy and ugly? All right, let's try that now. Yeah, I have a feeling that one is still just a little too much going out. Yeah, it's getting closer to what it should be. And I can still feel that in the middle here. It's a little bit here too. All right. Well, all right. That turned out okay. Let me show you the results. So, see right here, that's definitely a screw up on my part. The rest of it, though, is pretty good. One thing I have learned through the years is not to worry about this stage of things, because by the time you glue it up and then you hand plane and do all your surface prep, it's going to change the way it looks. And the only thing that I would do on this one is I would fill that in with a little bit of cherry so that the end grain, so the end grain is facing up like this. And you can see right here, this little, that is from the coping saw, actually. The coping saw cut a little bit into that. I noticed it when I was doing it. And so that's what that's from. But I would leave that because this is going to get hand planed, and it would get hand planed and everything later. And I have a feeling that that was not really going to be an issue. Over here, when that is square, that's tight. That closes up tight. So that's going to be okay. And yeah, so we're all good, and it's good on that side too. So anything tips about the coping saw? Not really. Use a fairly fine blade. Yeah. Everyone tries to be funny with me for some reason. So I hope that was, you picked up something good from that. Sorry that my dovetails didn't come out perfect. I have to admit, they almost never do. But like I said, you have to wait until you're finished to really evaluate them. The strength of those would be fine. They would glue up just fine. And like I said, I would fill that one little gap, and then you would not even notice it. I guess a lot of people always say like the difference between someone who's just starting out making furniture and someone who's been doing it for a long time is, knowing how to fix mistakes or hide mistakes. And that's definitely something I've learned to do. But also, you learn to mitigate your mistakes as well, to make them so they're not so terrible that it's impossible to fix or repair. And that is not something terrible. I would not feel bad about. I don't feel bad about that. I'm not thrilled about it, but I'm also not crazy happy about it. So I guess that's it for this morning. I appreciate you all tuning in to watch. Next weekend, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do yet, but I am going to get back to work on my credenza that I was making before I had my table saw accident and before I had to, then I just got distracted by a lot of Kumiko related stuff like finishing the book, making guide blocks for people. So if I can, I might next week talk about making and fitting drawers because that's what stage I'm at for the credenza. So if I can, I will do that. If not, I'll figure out something else. Check out my Instagram during the week. It's MEK Woodworks for announcements about when I'll be doing this, but most likely to be the same time again next weekend, and what I will be doing. If you're not yet, subscribe to my channel, as I mentioned, and have a good weekend. Stay safe and try not to go crazy during isolation. Later.